Who established school? They say that one man's junk is another man's treasure. It means that what might be trash to one person can be valuable to someone else. And it just so happens that in this video, we have two men who found old, dusty boxes sitting around in their respective attics. But unlike the first man who threw them out in the trash, the second man saw an opportunity to change the world. And that's exactly what he did. It's me. And this is the story of the man who invented school. When people think about all the greatest inventions ever made, things like fire, the wheel, sliced bread, the toilet, or even pizza, there are very few inventions that had more of an impact on humanity than school. Even though you might not like going to school, trust me when I say that life without it would suck. But it turns out that schools weren't always the way they are today. In fact, for most of human history, schools didn't even exist. All that changed after one man named Horace decided to set up shop in his attic. Horace Mann was born on May 4, 1796, in what is now called North Stonington, Connecticut. His father died before Horace was even 2 years old, leaving his mother to raise him and his 5 siblings alone. Despite being from humble beginnings, young Horace was considered a bright kid with a lot of potential. So when he was just 13 years old, his mother sent him away to live with his brother and work as his apprentice. This meant that Horace never got a formal education, but it did mean that he learned some very valuable skills that would help him out later in life, specifically writing. After working for his brother for 3 years, Horace then took on a series of odd jobs while continuing to write. He worked as a surveyor's assistant, a storekeeper, a postmaster, and even edited a newspaper for a while. Throughout all this, he also taught himself many subjects, including law, which eventually allowed him to become a lawyer. Throughout his career as a lawyer, Horace became known for taking on cases that fought for the rights of the common man. Some of his notable achievements included arguing a case that led to the abolition of imprisonment for debt and fighting against a corrupt Massachusetts governor. But despite having a decent legal career, Horace felt that his true calling was to be an educator. This was mainly because he had a first-hand account of how terrible schools were back then. You see, Horace didn't have any teachers when he was a kid, but when he wanted to learn something, he would go to his local library and borrow books to teach himself. That's how he taught himself Latin, Greek, and algebra. And he wasn't the only one doing this. Back then, if you wanted to get educated, you would simply borrow books from your local library and teach yourself. Libraries were basically the original online courses. The problem was that these libraries weren't free, and not everyone could afford them. Plus, the books they did have were often outdated or inaccurate. As Horace traveled around New England, he realized that the state of education was even worse outside of Massachusetts. In places like Kentucky and Tennessee, children would have to walk for miles to get to school. And the classes were so overcrowded that the teachers couldn't even tell if the kids actually knew how to read. On top of this, teachers themselves weren't paid very much. They didn't have many job prospects, so they often ended up moonlighting as farmers or blacksmiths to make extra cash. All this made Horace realize that education was easily one of the most important issues facing America. But despite this, almost no one cared about it. Politicians thought it was a local issue, and local governments thought it was a state issue. Everyone kept passing the buck until nobody was taking responsibility. But Horace didn't care. He was determined to make education a priority no matter what. In 1823, Horace started attending Second Congregational Church in Salem, where he met a wealthy widow named Elizabeth Peabody. The two quickly fell in love and married soon after. Together, they came up with a plan to tackle the education crisis. At first, Horace tried to influence politicians to support better schools, but he soon realized that they weren't interested. So he decided to do it himself. In 1824, Horace left his legal career to open the first private school in Boston. Within a few years, the school became very successful and attracted students from all over the country. But despite the school's success, Horace never made any money from it. In fact, he had to rely on donations from Elizabeth to keep it afloat. This wouldn't have been a big deal if Elizabeth was a rich woman, but she was already spending all her money funding her own social reform projects. To make matters worse, she passed away in 1834, leaving Horace practically penniless. Though despite all this, Horace was determined to continue his mission, so he wrote a bunch of letters to prominent figures around the country, asking them to donate money to his school. One of the people he wrote to was a wealthy businessman from New York City named John H. Garrison. Unlike most of the other rich people Horace had written to, Garrison actually agreed to donate money. Not only that, but he also asked Horace to come to New York and set up a similar school there. And that's when everything changed for Horace. In 1836, Horace partnered up with Garrison to open the American Free School in New York City. And although it started off small with just 6 students, within 5 years it had grown to over 200. By 1840, there were over 1,000 of these free schools across New York. And by 1850, the movement had spread to every single state in the Union, although free public schools weren't available to everyone yet. It laid the foundation for compulsory education laws, which would come about a decade later. But unfortunately, Horace never lived to see this happen. In 1859, at the age of 63, he passed away from a stroke. If he were alive today, he would be long forgotten. But fortunately for us, there is this thing called the internet that allows us to learn anything we want from the comfort of our own homes. And if you're looking to take advantage of the internet to learn new things, now back to the video. When Horace passed away, there were hundreds of private schools across the nation inspired by his methods. But as you probably guessed, private schools aren't cheap. And the poor people who benefited the most from Horace's work still couldn't afford them. It would take another decade for these schools to become truly free. But why did it take so long? Well, for most of American history, education wasn't really seen as a priority. Most politicians believed that the purpose of government was to protect the state from foreign invaders and ensure that people could trade and make money. Schools just didn't fit into this mindset. And since politicians were generally higher on the societal rungs than most people, they didn't feel the need to prioritize education. This all changed, however, after the Civil War. As the nation began to recover from the war, politicians realized that the best way to prevent another conflict would be to educate the masses. After all, what caused the Civil War, if not a failure to educate the southern states on the evils of slavery? So in 1862, Congress passed the Land Ordinance, which gave each state 30,000 acres of land for every male resident between the ages of 21 and 45. This was basically the federal government's way of saying, here, you can use this money to set up schools. And the timing couldn't have been any better. With the war having just ended, thousands of women who previously stayed at home taking care of the house, while their husbands went out to work, were now looking for jobs. And what better job than becoming a teacher? Unfortunately, there was one big problem. These women didn't have any qualifications or experience. But luckily for them, being a teacher didn't require any special skills. All you really needed was a good heart, patience, and a willingness to learn. So most states ended up creating normal schools to train teachers. These were essentially four-year programs that gave young women a crash course in teaching. They covered everything from teaching tactics to classroom management to lesson plans. This explosion in qualified teachers, coupled with the fact that states were now being given money to fund schools, meant that schools finally became free and compulsory. By the turn of the century, virtually every state had some form of compulsory education laws. And the rest, as they say, is history. Although thanks to Horace Mann, we'll never forget the importance of education. Do you think you would have liked going to school back in Horace's day? Comment that down below. Also drop a like if you think schools should focus less on standardized testing and more on actual learning. And of course, consider joining our community to suggest future video ideas and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'll see you guys on the next one.